Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Aldersgate Experience, the podcast of Aldersgate Church in York, Pennsylvania. We're back again.
That's right.
I'm Bob Kaylor.
And I'm Pastor Jeff Markey.
We're really glad to welcome you to this edition as we get into the third week of Lent now, coming up on this Sunday, but we just celebrated the second Sunday in Lent and the continuation of the Joseph story.
Time flies. And this week we were talking about getting out of the pit and removing yourself from recognizing the barriers that we have to deal with, the struggles, the pitfalls that we have. You specifically talked about one in your military experience, which was fascinating.
Yeah, we talked about being on the night land navigation course, which it's always stressful.
Yeah.
And everything is shrunken, so the distances seem to be shorter or longer depending on where you're at.
Wow.
And you can't navigate the terrain. You can't read the terrain. You can't read any of that stuff, and suddenly hit this sinkhole and fell into it. I told the story on Sunday.
Yeah, you guys can go back and hear the message. It was
But I think what's interesting about that, as I was thinking about it afterward, is that how those pits form in the field, there's a lot of parallels to how they form in our lives too. And there in Georgia, one of the things that's true about the landscape is that the water table is very close to the surface. So if you're digging a hole, and we dug a lot of holes in the infantry, if you're digging a hole...
Was it a form of punishment or...
No, you're digging your fighting position. So you're digging a hole. When you dig a fighting position, you stand in it up to your armpits. That's how deep you have to dig it. And then you put parapets up around it.
That's a lot of work.
And firing ports to shoot through. So it's a lot of work, especially with a little entrenching tool. But when you get down about 4 feet, you hit the water table. So you're digging this hole that you're going to be standing up in for long periods of time, and the water just rises as you're digging.
Yeah.
And it made me think about the fact that there are undercurrents that often form these pits, especially the ones that we walk into or that are of our own making. When we think about our lives, if we have bad habits, if we have past trauma, if we have things like that kind of bubble below the surface, a lot of times those will form pits for us when we're not expecting them.
Wow.
Emotionally.
That's fascinating.
And we'll hit those without knowing it. They'll cave in underneath us at the worst possible time. So there's another connection there that I thought was kind of interesting.
That is very interesting.
From the message and thinking about all of that experience. And it's completely disorienting when you hit that place. Everything comes apart, and trying to find your way out and then find your way back on the right path is really difficult. And of course, Joseph does not plan for any of this.
Right. He's
got this royal destiny he's on to. Now he finds himself in a pit, being sold into slavery from the top to the bottom. And he rises then from being the slave to being the second in the house. And then he has this downward spiral where he's falsely accused. So in both cases, these are not things that he planned for or that he precipitated. They're things that happened to him that he now has to deal with.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very intense. And you talked about in the message how Potiphar's wife had kind of tried to, get him in bed.
Boy toy.
Yep. And so how does Joseph deal with that temptation? What does that teach us when we're faced with temptation?
Well, I think Joseph does the right thing. First of all, he tries to avoid the situation. He knows he can't really go to Potiphar and say, hey, your wife is hitting on me.
Right.
That's not, he's still a slave, okay? So he can't really do that. But he does what he can control, which is, I'm going to try to stay away from this temptation. I'm going to remove myself from this. Yeah. So the text says that he's trying to avoid and be out of reach, but sometimes you can't avoid it, and that's what happens.
Right. Well, I mean, you mentioned he's a slave. So he's going to have to be accessible to them for all different types of reasons. And we do
find ourselves in places where we can't avoid that temptation coming at us, we have to learn how to deal with it. And how does Joseph deal with it? First of all, he states where he's at. He states what he believes. He believes that Potiphar has made him second in command. He knows he's got power, but he's choosing not to use it because he says, I don't want to violate my master's trust. And moreover, I don't want to sin against God.
Yeah.
So he's got clear boundaries there at the very beginning. And she's going to violate those boundaries by grabbing onto him, constantly harassing him, grabbing onto him. It's an interesting story because we so often see this in the other direction.
Yes. Well, yeah.
As I said, it's kind of a reverse Me Too moment.
I remember you saying that, yeah.
And Joseph leaves his cloak behind. He literally flees away from it. And that's, in the 1030 service, we talked about the text from James, resist the devil and he will flee from you. But the flip side of that is resistance also involves us fleeing away from that temptation, knowing what the trigger is and trying to avoid it, and then running from it when we have the chance.
Well, and it kind of speaks to Joseph's sanctity of marriage, his view of sanctity of marriage, and how important that is to not violate that covenant, even if it's not necessarily even his, right? He recognizes that with Potiphar and Potiphar's wife, and he does not want to step over that boundary.
Yeah, and such a contrast to Judah in Genesis 38, where Judah, I mean, his wife dies, but he's immediately, well, there's a prostitute along the road. Let's do that. You know, that'll be fun.
And that's back in last week's Bible break, right? Midweek Bible break. You can go back and look at what Judah and Tamar.
It's just a powerful contrast in these two characters, and yet Judah's going to be the one through whom the royal line actually comes.
Right.
So there's an interesting juxtaposition there that we'll get into a little bit later, but Joseph is demonstrating integrity. He's got boundaries. He understands his destiny. He understands what he's about, and he's not going to allow something to get in the way that he can control. And so he's going to remove himself from that. And so I think for us, when we're faced with temptation, which inevitably is going to happen, Paul says in 2 Corinthians, you're going to be tempted, but God provides a way out if we'll take it.
Yeah.
So often we become like Esau in that bowl of soup. We want to
tunnel vision.
We want to grab onto it. That's all we can think about.
Yes.
Whereas Joseph understands the bigger picture. And he seems to understand the bigger picture throughout this story. That's one of the big differences between Joseph and some of the other characters we've talked about here in Genesis. He has the long view in mind. And because of that, he's going to act in a way to achieve that longer view.
Yeah.
The goodness that God is going to bring. And that's why this story kind of falls at the end. Joseph is, in a way, at least a literary way, correcting a lot of the mistakes that others have made throughout the text.
Well, and you mentioned that in previous podcasts, we've talked about Jacob and Esau, and Jacob kind of plays the long game, whereas Esau is really held up by his triggers, you know, the things that just step out in front of him and he just lunges at them.
Yeah.
And we see that we talked about, you know, Tamar and Judah.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, these are recurring themes. We seem to coming back to them, but Genesis kind of goes looping back on itself over and over again because human sin does that to us. It's a cyclical thing, and we get trapped in this slavery.
Right.
It's interesting. Joseph is a slave, but he's not.
Right.
He's a slave in the sense that he's a slave in Egypt,
physical world,
but he's not a slave to his desires. He's not a slave to sin. He's not a slave to those kinds of things. He is free in that sense. So he's as free as you can be in his own person.
Now, you made this statement in your message, your attitude determines your altitude.
Yeah.
And so can we talk a little bit more about that and how we'd apply that to our lives?
I've seen so many people in my life, and I think you've seen this too in ministry, where you're working with people over time, and there are people dealing with all kinds of difficult circumstances, things of their own making, things that are not of their own making, illnesses, things like that.
Yeah.
How do I approach those things? I can't control what's happened to me or the consequences of what's happened to me, but how do I control my response to it?
Right.
And I have seen over and over again that when a person has an attitude of, I'm in the moment, but I understand God's at work. I trust that God is going to work things out for good. Their ability to be resilient in the midst of that crisis is elevated. Their ability to see beyond it, their ability to still have joy in the midst of difficulty, it's a chosen thing. It's not simply how I feel, I'm choosing this. And when we choose that, then our emotions tend to follow.
Yeah.
We will choose to do the right thing, as we've talked about doing the next right thing. But I think in this case, it's choosing an attitude of gratitude. I'm going to focus on what I have rather than what I don't have. I'm going to focus on where I am rather than where I'm not.
Yeah. I'm going to focus on what I believe God intends for my life rather than what these circumstances around me are causing me to experience.
Yeah, if God has my best interests at heart,
yes,
then no matter what's happened, whether I caused it or something else caused it, I can use that for good.
There is a lesson to be learned in adversity and pain and suffering. And even though those things are they're very painful and difficult to go through, they are temporal. And if we're willing to see the long view, to recognize that there is a good purpose for this, it can turn things all around in our lives. We can make them lessons and speed bumps rather than roadblocks.
Yeah. That's one of the things we're going to talk about this coming Sunday when we're talking about Joseph now being in prison, and he's going to interpret dreams of the king's baker and his cupbearer. But then Joseph's going to be forgotten, and he's going to languish in this prison for a couple of years. And you wonder, well, what is God's timing here? Why is this happening to him in this long period of time? And as Tom Petty once sang, the waiting is the hardest part.
Yeah.
We're waiting on God to do something. But how many times in the Old Testament do we read, wait upon the Lord?
Yeah.
Those who wait upon the Lord renew their strength. Those who are patient in suffering, those who are persevering, they tend to see the crown at the end.
It requires a great deal of trust that God is in the moment. God is with you through that. And it's often that when we don't see the promises, when we don't necessarily see the horizon, but when we're with him, that he is setting all these things in motion. If we just trust him. Him.
Jesus talks about this when he talks about only worrying about today. And this is advice I have to give myself, and it's oftentimes advice when I give to people when they're going through something like this. Focus on what you can do today.
Yeah.
I can't control tomorrow. I can't control yesterday.
Right.
Those are gone. Yesterday's gone. Tomorrow hasn't happened yet, and we tend to build up in our minds 1,000 horrible things that will happen. I mean, as I've said often, I'm the chief worrier in my house. That's my designated role.
Contingencies for contingencies.
And and I have to remind myself that I need to be in the moment, that I can, what can I do today?
Right.
That is going to help further the kingdom. How am I going to use whatever's happening with me in that moment, the people around me, to do God's will in that particular moment? So it's really kind of granular thinking. I'm only thinking about today. I'm only thinking about the next thing. I may have plans down the road, but God has that covered. What am I going to do today? What's within my control? And that's where that attitude determines altitude, where I can be elevated, maybe not all at once. How long did it take for Joseph to move from being the lowly slave in the house to being the chief steward at Potiphar's house?
Right.
How long did that take? I'm guessing it wasn't 20 minutes.
No.
It probably took a while.
It was likely years.
But he was persistent and persevering through that process. And I think that's one of the things we have to really consider.
Yeah.
One of the fruits of the Spirit is patience. I think it's a fruit of the Spirit because it doesn't come naturally to us.
Right.
I know it doesn't come naturally to me.
Right.
So I almost have to write down, what can I do today?
Yeah.
Here's my daily focus.
Yeah.
other stuff I'm going to put aside for now. I can't
God's
control
design.
that. Yeah.
Right.
We are not guaranteed tomorrow. We don't know what the future is going to hold. And sometimes God has something even better for us than we imagined.
Absolutely.
If we're willing to wait for it.
Well, and we see later in the story, Joseph's brothers come to him. They don't recognize him. Obviously, we're talking about likely decades.
Yeah. Yeah.
Likely decades.
Yeah.
So that's a long time to go through this cycle.
Yeah, it's hard to tell how long this period of time is in this story, but it's lengthy.
Yeah.
And Joseph plays the long game.
Absolutely.
But it comes to that critical point at the end, and spoiler alert,
Yeah.
things work out for good.
Yes.
But Joseph is playing that long game. And I think that's really instructive to us as we think about it. We're going to talk more about God's timing this week.
No doubt. So you used the Wesley prayer to close this message this past Sunday. And it's not the normal, like, Lord, bless me, help me to do X, Y, and Z, whatever. It's not one of those prayers, but a prayer of surrender. And so how does this prayer connect with the proper attitude of faith?
Well, let me say the prayer again, because I think it's really instructive.
Yeah.
I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Rank me with whom you will. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. Those are the guts of the prayer. I'm no longer my own, but I'm yours. I've put myself completely in your hands, Wesley says. So you do with me what you want.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
I'll just say, do you mind if I...
No, please.
Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you. That's a hard prayer to pray.
Yeah.
Or laid aside for you.
Yeah. When I was in seminary, we had a guest preacher once during chapel, and he said, all of y'all here, this was in Kentucky.
Yeah.
All y'all think about praying to God, and you do pray to God. You say, Lord, use me. And then you get mad when God does, not in the way that you wanted.
Yeah, that's very true. That's very true.
But this is a Lord, use me prayer, or don't in this particular moment.
Right. If I'm in your way, God, set me aside.
You're not ready for this. This is not you. I didn't call you to this.
Right.
I'm going to lay you aside for this. We have ambition. I mean, you've probably had these kinds of moments where, before coming to Aldersgate, for example, I had an opportunity to be in the running for a job at a seminary, and I was really excited about it. I thought it was going to be perfect, all those kinds of things, and I came in second for that job. Yeah. But the more I thought about it, and especially coming here, I realized God was like, no, I want you here. And we could not be in a better place because God said, no, this is where you need to be.
But they're hard lessons. They're hard things to deal with.
But I think as you get older, you learn that more and more. I think that's why Joseph does play the long game. When he gets to be older, he's able to then forgive. He's able to understand how things have worked out in that sense. And I think for myself, just speaking personally, I feel like God has really been in the midst of the timing of all of this. Yeah. And coming here and being part of this congregation and all of that. I'm just so blessed by that.
It's tough. You mentioned years of experience, and I do believe experience helps color our perspective with those types of things. It's very difficult, especially when you're young and you're excited, chomping at the bit. For me, my first full time in ministry, my pastor said, you're not ready. And I said, okay, well, I need to go to seminary. It was one of the hardest things I had to hear. Yeah. But at the same point, God blessed me through this seminary experience that I had. And I was so grateful to be able to have that preparation for ministry. Yeah. If I didn't have it, I wouldn't be here today.
Yeah. Yeah. We get ambitious. We want to do these things, but God says, no, I've got a map for you. And if you're willing to pay attention. And how often do we not pay attention and we charge ahead and then we find out, whoa, this was the wrong thing. And I've done that in the past too. Now, even God can take and work that for good. Where I've manufactured a position that I got to and it wasn't all that I'd hoped it would be. And it almost put me out of ministry. Yeah. It was a lesson to me to say, okay, God, I am no longer going to be the one pulling the strings on this.
That's huge.
This is up to you. And that's what this prayer says.
Yeah.
you take this and do with it what you will. And since that time, and that was that was like 1998.
Wow.
Since that
That's a long time ago.
Since that time.
That's many sleeps.
God has always, when we've been patient, when we've waited upon the Lord, it's always worked for good.
For good.
So that's been my experience.
Yeah.
Others might have different experience, but that's been my experience. I get in trouble when I'm trying to manufacture everything, but when I wait upon the Lord, things tend to work the way they're supposed to.
Yeah, we're singing this song at the contemporary service, "See a Victory," and I think it's put out by Elevation Worship. And you take what the enemy meant for evil and you turn it for good. It's just literally taking the words right out of Joseph's mouth.
Yeah, you might sense that this is a theme.
Right.
Because that's the theme of the Joseph story.
Right.
So we're going to hammer this a lot over these 6 weeks of Lent.
So we apologize for the
it's a constant thing. But maybe we'll get it by the time we get to the end of the Joseph story.
There is always a reason why these things keep coming up in Scripture and lessons to learn.
Yeah.
So much.
Again, it's a Genesis kind of takes us back again and again to these themes, and I love that about this book. It really does help us to focus. The last half of this prayer, it really focuses on our opportunity to really consecrate ourselves to the Lord. I freely and heartily yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. And now, O glorious and blessed God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you are mine and I am yours. So be it. I just love that. You are mine and I am yours. I pray that would be our prayer as a church, and if you're listening and not a part of a church, that you'd be able to be a part and really consecrate yourself just like that, just like what John Wesley had. Yeah, and when we are the Lord's, He has great things in store for us. Not things that we might have ever imagined, but they will be a blessing to us and to others when we live them out. Well, lots of great stuff here. We'll talk more this coming Sunday as we get into Genesis 40 and 41. I encourage you to take a look at those two passages as we dive into the text. Yeah. Genesis 40 and 41, the story of Joseph being elevated from prison to the palace. Sheesh, that's awesome. It's a really great story, but we're not going to be able to read both chapters. Come on. As part of this sermon. 2 hour long service. We can do it. I'm down, but I don't think anybody else would be. So we encourage you to read all of that. There are some churches that are very much they're really good at that. But we have other things we're doing too. And one of those things is, weekly communion, which again takes us to that place. It's a baseline place to say, remember what God has done for us. Remember God following through in Jesus Christ. God always does that. And when we take communion every Sunday, that's what we're signifying. God's grace is always present. We're always invited into the midst of that. God is with us. God cares for us, and God has done. What do we say in the liturgy? Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Past, present, future, God is at work. Yes. And that's the exciting part of that. Absolutely. Well, we're so glad you've joined us again. If you have questions or comments you want to send, you can drop them on our YouTube page. Yeah, please like, comment, share, and we'd be happy to, if you have a question, post it in the comments, and we'll absolutely get to that. You can also email us at communications@aldersgateyork.com. We encourage you to jump on and watch the sermons and these videos and the midweek Bible break. We've got some small groups that have formed. There's some discussion guides on our website as well under the groups tab. You can find all that stuff there. So there's lots of content for this series. We're really, I'm loving doing this series during Lent. It's a different approach to Lent. It's been wonderful. I've really enjoyed looking at Joseph. Well, we want to thank producer Randy, who's behind the cameras running everything for us. We're glad you've joined us for this episode of the Aldersgate Experience, and we'll see you back here next week. God bless.